Hotep, and welcome. I'm Morgan, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast. And for this show, it's a kind of continuation of the previous episode 62, I think, in which I started to talk about the Decans, or return to the issue of the Decans, specifically inspired by Jake Stratton-Kent's book Geosophia and some of the ideas in that, but extending the quest, as it were, into the Egyptian tradition, which I kind of probably fairly say I know more about. So this is part two. In part one, we talked a bit about Jake, and we talked about his version of an important magical concept of the night journey, or the journey, not always at night, but it's sort of at night, but also throughout the year and throughout the month. It's kind of wheels within wheels thing, which brought to mind the idea of a ritual cycle, uh, which turned into a demonic cycle, which we're probably going to talk a little bit more about, and the importance, as Jake would put it, of the planetary hours, which again is this concept of wheels within wheels. So do check out the previous recording. For this one, uh, as I say, I'm going to sort of pick up on that. I should say that I kind of edit this after I do the recording, and then, as you might expect, I kind of edit and add some of the pictures that I mentioned that I think are rather good. And I've got an animation which I discovered I can just leave it running in the background when I'm not showing other pictures. And if you look at it, it moves quite slowly. You get this rising and falling of a selection of stars that are in a kind of a belt, if you like, in the due south of the ecliptic, really, which from the point of view of the observer, rise and fall, and it's kind of like watching the hands on a clock, in effect. The animation that I put up there is uses Egyptian star lore as far as that is known, so that's quite interesting. I took that from Stellarium, which is a well-known open source astrological program, which is very, very useful for visualizing some of these things. So the little plug for them. Okay, so picking up on that, something I kind of put in the original script for this talk, but I crossed out. But I think I will talk about this. It's just to remind you that we ended last time talking about this very interesting set of texts, which people have this sort of love-hate relationship with, depending on who the particular person is. People build it up and say how wonderful it is, this PGM, the Greek magical papyri or the Egyptian magical papyri, and then they kind of get stuck into it. And then they decide that they don't like it again, you know. So as if everybody flip flops, but I think you've got to keep it in perspective. But it is a fairly useful insight into the Egyptian magical world. And in fact, it's been said that these are sort of miniature versions of Egyptian temple rituals. Not all of them, but because it's a very extensive collection. But in a sense, that's quite a lot of them. That's how they function. It's quite easy to show a connection between these rituals, which were kind of put together in a period in Egypt when the Greeks were the kings of the land, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, and then his generals took over. But I think, so to emphasize that, I was going to talk about how originally there is a correspondence between the Greek gods, which became more popular in later times, and of course, which Jake really kind of related to, and the Egyptian gods. And often a spell within this collection will use a Greek name, but it seems obvious that they're kind of really referring to a sort of Egyptianized version of that particular god, or vice versa. And it's a Greekified version of an Egyptian god. So there is a correspondence, a various correspondence between the Greek gods and the major Egyptian gods in one of the families of gods, or pantheons, if you like. So a very, very common god in the Greek magical papyri is, of course, the sun god Helios, which is hardly surprising. It's very popular in almost every mythology because he's the one who gives us life. And he would correspond, being the top of the system, with, in the Egyptian system, either the god Amun, or the god Aten, or the god Ra, mostly. Then you've got a very interesting god called Shu in the Egyptian tradition. And Shu is the sender of winds. And Shu's function also, which is where we connect, is as the one who controls this very interesting cycle of stars, which you'll see in kind of running in the background. The decanal stars are kind of driven by the power of this god Shu. In some mythologies or some cosmologies in Egypt, Shu is almost like the major creator god. Shu and Tefnut, the two together, there's a kind of whole theology that almost focuses on them as this divine couple, which is a very, very interesting connection. So Shu, Tefnut, as I mentioned, would correspond, I suppose, with Aphrodite or Venus. I should say Shu would probably correspond with Jupiter, the god Jupiter, within the older traditions, or Zeus, as this creator god, if you like, as the one who actually gets things going. He may not have created the entire system, but he's the one who kind of really is the driving energy and behind it all. Then, of course, within the Egyptian system, you have a very famous god, which is Geb, the earth god. And he corresponds more or less with Kronos or Saturn. Then, of course, you have the goddess, very, very important in the Egyptian tradition and connected with the Decans as well. They're all part of her in some sense. Is the star goddess Nut, or Nuit, who is referred to in the Greek magical papyri often as the mother of the gods. And of course, she's in all traditions, she is the mother, and she's the sky mother, which is another useful version within the Egyptian way of looking at things. Usually it's earth mother, sky father, but in Egypt you have this very interesting inversion of earth father and sky mother. And then, of course, you've got Osiris, one of the kind of most important cults, the two, Ra, the sun god, and then Osiris is probably number two in popularity. Osiris in the Greek magical papyri is often just called Osiris, funny enough, or one of his subsidiary names. But he could also correspond with the god Dionysus within the Greek tradition. And in the late period, there are lots of specialist forms of this cult of Dionysus. The goddess Isis, of course, Isis, even in the Greek tradition, often appears as just herself, as Isis, but sometimes again she is Aphrodite. Then other gods, you've got the god Set, of course, who is an incredibly important mover and shaker within the Egyptian system. And there's some sort of correspondence between him and the Greek god the Typhon. People often talk about the Typhonian tradition. Typhon isn't as, I'm kind of say, it's not as complicated, I don't think, a god as the god Set, but whatever way you look at it, the Greeks eventually assimilated the Egyptian god Set to to their idea of the god Typhon, and that's probably one of the reasons why the Setian tradition has this sort of looks as if it's not so important as it is, because some aspects of Set, lots of the positive aspects of the god Set have kind of been missed out with this appropriation. Then you got his partner, the goddess Nephthys, very interesting goddess as well. And again, she just appears under her own name in a sort of more mutated Greek form. I think it's SN Nephus. Maybe you can see the Nephus bit is like Nephis. So it's a sort of phonetic rendering of the word Nephis. They don't, so one presumes they don't really have an exact equivalent of that within the Greek tradition. Let's just say in the PGM you do get the planets as well. You get Hermes, goes where the other planets are. If you call the sun a planet, Helios a planet, you get Hermes, which goes with the god Mercury, or planet Mercury, if you like. Aphrodite, which is Venus. Helios, as I mentioned, is the sun. Ares is Mars. Selene is the moon. Zeus is Jupiter, and Kronos is Saturn. So these are the kind of connections with the thing we talked about, the planetary days, the connection between the planets and days of the week. You have a kind of selected version of the gods in both traditions that seem to have these slightly more central position to do. So the Egyptian equivalent of the 7 gods which are used in the planets would be based on what's known as the old Heliopolitan Ennead, or pantheon, if you like, or family, which is the sort of hierarchy as well, which is the way the Egyptians kind of envisaged their various gods. They grouped them into little families or big families and extended families. So you have Amun, Ra, Shu, and Tefnut, Geb and Nuit, Isis and Osiris. Now, there's kind of difficulty, I suppose, is that as I have to remind you several times and remind myself several times, the original Egyptian week was actually 10 days. So if we wanted to kind of really transfer one into the other, perhaps you could experiment. You could fill the gap with Set and Nephthys, and also Horus the Elder. So you can get, or there's a very interesting system which we haven't got time to talk about now, which are the 10 forms of the god Amun, 10 being a very important sequence within Western magic. If you think about things like the so-called Kabbalistic tree that people find so inspiring and useful a way of looking at things, there you've got the 10 forms of Amun. But I'm not going to talk about this now. I should say a lot of this material I'm talking about comes from a work in progress, kind of hopefully a major work, which I'm going to call the Magick of the Sky, which is all of this stuff to do with the sky and the Decans and star maps, and the planets and all the rest. But also because it's the primary goddess connected with that is the goddess Nuit, the star goddess again. So although it's the magic of the sky, it's also very, I was going to say earthy, but it also isn't earthy, but it's very sensual, sexual, in fact, because that is the nature of Nuit. So the magic of the sky is also like the precursor of the later systems of things like Tantra and sexual magic and all the rest. It's all related, the magic of the sky. And in fact, I know a few things about the Tantric tradition of India itself, and you'll find there is this kind of astrological or astronomical undercurrent in all of the tantric texts as well. But that's another thing. Okay, so going back to the planetary hours, as I say, this is a kind of wheel within a wheel thing. The first hour of Sunday is sacred to the sun, right? 24 hours later, and the first hour of Monday will be sacred to the moon. And I've put a table, maybe I'll repeat that here. At the end of the last one, I inserted a table of, which may be a little bit off-putting, but a table, you can just have it near you, and it occurs in a lot of books to remind you. Most of the time, you only need to know the first hour. The other, because that's probably the most important moment to relate to in terms of a magical operation. It is the first hour of any particular day, or perhaps the final hour of that. So it's, but sometimes it's too difficult to do a ritual at that particular moment, or you need to do a ritual. I think there's an example in Jacob why it might be difficult to do in the middle of the night. If you have to do certain things, you might need bright sunlight or whatever. So you need to know the others, but you can kind of just look them up in a table. In some ways, the table is a little bit of a kind of which is a little bit arbitrary. It's a kind of made up thing. It might not, as I mentioned, have any actual relationship with the cosmos itself, the actual movement of the planets. It's almost like a virtual reality thing, rather than a kind of actual observation. And that's that. So people in magic, you just get on with that. You just accept that. But after a while, you kind of think about it. Whether you try and use something that might actually have a relationship to physical reality, which is, as I say, is a kind of pagan project in a lot of ways, is to bring things back to earth them, to make them real rather than just imaginary. Okay, so I don't know, probably is another transgression. We'll probably have to have another version of this, but I mean, if you know anything about astrology, the popular astrology even that you see in the newspapers or on the internet now and everything like that, you're probably aware that when that system was put together, we're talking about 2,000 years ago now, right? In the Greek period, when that kind of, there's not a lot of stuff in astrology that wasn't kind of set down 2,000 years ago. So when people say, "Oh, your sun or whatever is in Pisces," as it might be, this would have been true 2,000 years ago. But due to the way the universe works, 2,000 years later, and actually the signs have kind of moved around a little bit. So, but we still use the system of astrology to, as it was in this kind of virtual zodiac as it existed 2,000 years ago. And there's a certain amount of debate. Is there debate, or not? It might be, you probably are only in my head, of why that might be so. I should say that when I first got involved with Amukos, which is an East-West Tantric order, which is still quite important to me, we had to learn this, a certain amount of astrology. Like I mentioned last time, when you do the Golden Dawn training, you have to learn certain basic things. And for the Amukos astrology was one of these things. But the astrology that they taught in Amukos, which we call Tantric astrology, was actually had sort of updated the Greek system, had allowed it to kind of come up to date. And the effect of that was that as a sidereal, your horoscope, as you might have lived with, as in my case, I lived with this horoscope that someone had cast for me, but whenever it was, 20 years ago or something like that, and that was quite amazing. It seemed so insightful. And then you join a Mukos and they tell you, well, actually, you're a different sign. You're not Piscean, you're Aquarius. But the weird thing was that in terms of analyzing one's personality, the old system that I'd learned before seemed to kind of work better. I know people say, oh, Indian astrology is supposed to be very, very accurate and predictions and all this sort of stuff. Perhaps it is, perhaps we weren't very good at it. But it did strike me that whenever anybody did this, I still feel that I'm pretty much a Piscean rather than an Aquarian. I've got Aquarian aspects, maybe you'd say, or maybe it's to do with there's a certain amount of choice in this. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression to do with the way the systems that everybody uses in magic. They often, in certain spheres of magic, they talk about them as if they're incredibly precise. But actually, when you dig down, you find that there's always a little bit of compromise taking place and a little bit of virtual reality or intentionality at work there that people don't always like to acknowledge. The question I posed in the thing at this point is, so the planetary hours, or the star clock, if you like, or the planetary clock that we use, or some people use for their magic, especially if they're practicing goetic magic, where they have to be incredibly careful, apparently. Of course, it's based around the 24-hour clock, which, as we mentioned last time, was an Egyptian invention or innovation, if you like. But as with everything you kind of read in the literature or whatever, you should every now and again you should ask yourself this question: why 24 hours? Why are there 24 hours in the clock? Why not 26 or 22 or I don't know, or 21 or 23 hours? Why is that? Is it sort of built into the nature of the universe, or is it another one of these um, subtle, arbitrary things? This sort of speaks to me as well about the idea that are important in lots of magical systems, but especially Tantra, that one should unravel yourself in one way. You should decondition yourself. You should look at the purpose of astrology within the tantric tradition, and I think probably elsewhere, is not necessary to make predictions, but to kind of insights into your personality and the patterns that exist that maybe you were just taught a certain thing and you haven't ever really thought about, well, is it ain't necessarily so, as it says in the famous song. It could be different. And the 24 hours is another one of these patterns that's so embedded in our consciousness that it's a little bit sort of mind blowing if you think, well, maybe it could be different. Anyway, one way or another, it's been around an awful long time, and the Egyptians are the ones who came up with this, which is it's good to remember that, because people often write that it's always all the Babylonians or the Mesopotamians who did all this technical stuff. Maybe they did, maybe they came up with that, but it just so happens that it's, as is often the case, it will be the Egyptian source that we're having to use, because that's the one that's survived, and perhaps it was the first one. It's certainly usually the oldest source of the 24-hour clock. To understand some of these patterns, and we understand them in order to kind of sometimes to transcend them, but at least to know what's going on, right, in our universe and in the world about us, which is again what one of the functions of even the goetic magic is about: self-knowledge in some way. So you have to know what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so we're talking about star clocks, from which is a big deal within the Egyptian tradition from very early on, and some of the best examples of star clocks, like the thing that's running on the screen, but they didn't have that, of course. But well, they had the natural thing happening in the sky, but they also had a way of transcribing it into these very, very interesting diagrams. Um, and I put one up now. This is called a Ramesside star clock, but meaning it comes from the time of the kings. I suppose the most famous of which would have been Ramesses II or Ramesses the Great. He's the one who appears in all the movies, and almost more images of him in Egypt than anybody else, as kind of bit of an ego tripper. And he was around for a long time, so he had a long time to kind of make a lot of these images. So from the tomb, the painted walls of the tombs, one of the things that people probably don't even notice because it's so obscure, uh, and there's so much else that seems more dramatic, is this Ramessid star clock. And what it shows is a kind of representation of a person, probably a priest, I would have thought, or a magician or a scribe of some sort, sitting in a characteristic posture of ancient Egypt, the kneeling posture. Again, these are techniques of the body that we can kind of gather from some of these images. He's looking full front at us, which you can say is unusual or distinctive. Often, uh, faces like that, you see them from the side. But he's looking full at us. He has rather big ears, which is probably intentional as well when you kind of work out what they're going to do with this picture, or what it represents a particular activity. This picture, you've got the grid structure around it. I'll show it a couple of different versions of it. I'll show it as it actually looks, where it's very eroded, of course, because it's so old. We're talking about something that's about 3,500 years old, and has gone through a lot of kind of whatever, people walking past it, and water damage, and just time. The passage of time itself has kind of damaged some of these objects. So it's a depiction of a particular activity, and one might presume that basically there's a text that goes with this. You could tell that if you wanted to know the time, then it's almost like you would sit against the background of the stars, like the background that's sort of revolving. You would sit against it in that posture, hopefully the same posture each time, and you would have a second person, a priest or whatever, an assistant, who would use you as a kind of sighting structure. They would look at you, and I suppose this is maybe the function of the really big ears on this image, because one of the things it says, when such and such a star touches the left ear of the priest, meaning when it can be seen just near the ear, physically in the sky, then it's, I don't know, it's the third hour of the night, for instance. And you could do that with all the other parts of the body, so that it might be that this represents a not a human being, but a statue, an image of a statue image that was placed on a particular part of the temple, and people kind of viewed it in relation to the sky, and they could use that to sort of mark the hours and call them out at some point. So that's, to me, that's really very interesting already, right? The whole pattern with about that. So uh, people who look at that, they think, well, it's sort of it's not likely to be that accurate, right, from day to day. Because you would have to make sure, if it was a person, you have to make sure that they're always in the same position, right? If they're going to be the sort of sighting thing. And likewise, the person who's looking at them um, would have to make sure that there's some sort of mark on the floor. There are marks on the floor, strangely enough, or on the roofs of temples. There are marks and footprints that have been put there. Perhaps they have been put there in order to say, well, you stand in this spot and you look at so and so, so and so, and you can use this star clock. I mean, if I could give you another digression, people talk about Afna Konsu, this priest who is very, I don't know, important to Aleister Crowley. His footprints and those of other members of his family are actually on top of the temple of Khonsu, the moon god at Karnak. So you know what, quite a bit about him. But perhaps that's one of the functions of these footprints that are marked on the roof, was that they were saying, "Well, stand there." But whatever way you look at it, it's not going to be a very precise way of, but it'll give you a rough idea, right? And you'll know that time is passing. Maybe that's the main thing. So, as I say, just to remind you, in terms of Egyptian history, well, I'll keep that image of the star clock on screen. The earliest accessible bits to us are texts of star clocks like this. Was this from the Ninth Dynasty, which is even before the Ramesses the Great and his various ancestors, who also were called Ramesses. But that would be about 2150 before the Common Era, which is not that long after some people say the pyramids, the Great Pyramids, were made. So it's very, very old history. I guess that could be about 1,000 years though before the Ramesside time. So this information and data was around for a long time, even within Egyptian terms. So the earlier stuff, you don't find much of this technical astronomy stuff yet, anyway, that we know from the actual Great Pyramids themselves. There's something, but nothing quite like, I don't think I'd have found a version of this star clock using a person as a sighting tool. So there are not that many astrological texts from them, or certainly maybe not many that we kind of recognize for what they are. But we can assume that there would have been. The second age then of astronomical monuments are this Ramesside period, which goes on for quite a long time, and which this star clock that we're looking at, first sample, I've got lots of other samples of doing different things, which was very, very interesting to me anyway. I hope it'll be interesting to you. So you've got all the famous monuments, the tombs with the painted astrological ceilings, the mortuary temples that are set out like astronomical observatories, and you can imply certain data from them. And of course, very, very central to this is a monument whose importance to magic is difficult to underestimate, which is the Osirion, which was an underground structure, in fact, located sort of underneath the temple of Seti the First, who was Ramesses the Second's father, at Abydos, which in itself is a very, very important place in terms of astronomy. Even the landscape is important in terms of astronomy. But we're just touching the surface now. We're sort of introducing some of the core subjects. The third period for astronomy is the later Ptolemaic period, the Greek period, when foreign influences were much more dominant. And this is when you get things the introduction of the famous zodiac, which we mentioned earlier, and that we still make a lot of use of, and the final assimilation, I suppose, absorption of the Egyptian concepts into the Greek way of looking at things, and other foreign ways of looking at things, to such an extent that sometimes the Egyptian background to this stuff is lost, as it was lost for a long time, but it seems to be re-emerging now as and getting its rightful due as central to this. There's also a period in this late time when the Nubian kings ruled Egypt, who were kind of black pharaohs uh, from what is now the Sudan. And they were very into the cult of Amun and built monuments that are very like Egyptian monuments that kind of obviously were very into the culture. And they didn't just ape or copy the Egyptian culture that they loved, they added something to it. And some people say it, the things we call mystery culture of later times, that's their work, that they're kind of reforming of the whole system, which they looked up quite deep, and they kind of got rid of some of the stuff that was a bit obscure to them, and they kind of put stuff in there. So that stuff about the 10 incarnations of Amun, the 10 steps, if you like, the 10 spheres, that would come from that period as well. So, as I say, if I take you back in time again to the first period, and focus on this most important concept, is focusing on the Deccan. So I don't mind repeating myself, because I know this is it's a bit unusual, but can be a bit hard work. But once you get the idea of it, especially if you see it moving on the screen, it makes a lot of sense. It's using your environment as a kind of orientation device, as a kind of clock in some sort of way, which is obviously important for the practice of magic from that period. The Decans, these were features in the sky. These were groups of stars, basically, that were used to measure time. So we talked about the star clock, and we've got this figure of watching this passage of the stars at one side of the body and down the other. And they, over the course of a year, they would change on a sort of cycle. Different stars would rise and fall, and that group is basically, in order to work the decanal system for a whole year, a whole lunar year, you need basically 36 different patterns of little constellations in the sky. They're not the normal constellations. Some of them overlap with the zodiac. They're not the same as the zodiac. They're slightly further south, which is useful as well, because it means they're visible in the southern hemisphere sometimes. And sometimes they're not visible in our world. So they've got a kind of a bit more life to them. They're coming and going. But basically, the decans, meaning the 10-day period, there are 36 of those in the course of a year. That's overlap a little bit, but basically that is identified by the Egyptians as a kind of clock embedded in the sky that determined an awful lot of the way they did things, especially how the way they practiced their magic, either in the temple sphere or in the personal sphere. And that way of going about things, using the decans to pace you and to tell you the correct moment to do things, is essentially what the planetary hours of later times does, the same sort of thing. I would say the decanal system is closer to reality in lots of ways. It does actually relate to real physical stars in the sky. I know they're not necessarily familiar to us, but we can look them up and we can know they exist. And in the book that my book, in fact, the demonic calendar, the latest version I gave certainly one family, one sequence of these decanal stars, and kind of indicate the sort of things they might have meant to the ancient Egyptians in terms of what they might have been as an omen, and then how that comes down to us through the years, because different cultures, right up until quite recently, even in the tarot, have taken this mystery and reinterpreted it and appended different ideas to it. And all of that is given in much more detail in the book Demonic Calendar. I'll refer to some of it, but obviously you're talking about a lot of data that probably wouldn't be that easy to digest if I try and explain it. I'm just trying to point you to it. Uh, so, as I say, these are features in the sky used to measure time. This was done by simply looking at the stars and the constellations as they rose and fell on the horizon. As they, in the night, stars rise up. You don't know this already, go and sit outside for a few hours and you'll see that the stars rise and they kind of culminate. And there's a whole kind of thing going on. But so you can look at my animation as well. In the Ramesside period, they use a slightly different way of measuring the same things. So instead of measuring them at the horizon, they measured them as they got to their maximum height within the sky. Uh, and began their downward journeys. There's a thing called a transit. A transit being in when a star passes overhead virtually. Might not, it's sort of as high as it is in the sky. It might not be physically right over your head, but when you look, you can see it's got as high as it's going to get, and it's beginning to descend. That's known as a transit. Although technically it's when it passes the celestial pole or the meridian to the north. In the later times, the Ptolemaic times, which is closer to us in lots of ways, and we seem to know more about it, they used a hybrid system of decans. They didn't use the Egyptian decanal belt. They kind of used this newfangled thing called the zodiac, as it was then, and they divided that into decanal segments, perhaps in a slightly more precise way, some would say, but that they transferred the Egyptian system to this Babylonian system of the zodiac. And you do get famous monuments in Egypt which have both systems side by side. The famous zodiac of Dendera, you know it well, I'll put a picture up there, combines the Egyptian system of decans with the Greek tradition of the zodiac, one way or another. So it's a combination of both systems. As I say, the primary measuring instrument for observing the sky in this sort of stuff was the human body. And the body, especially within the Egyptian tradition, was also used to conceptualize many other, perhaps all aspects of the external world, as above, so below, if you like, or as in inside, so outside, whatever you want to put it in those terms. But whatever, the body is the primary instrument with which we interact with the world and measure the world and conceptualize all sorts of other things one way or another. That might seem incredibly obvious. I don't know. But it isn't actually that obvious to a lot of people. And it has enormous implications in terms of philosophy, magic, anything. And for instance, it's why I would say it's legitimate to call Egypt one of the first uh, tantric cultures. Uh, As I say, the Egyptians were the first to divide the sky into 24 hours, or the day into 24 hours as well. 12 hours for the day and 12 hours for the night. A nice, interesting suggestion when we were talking about the body is one explanation. There are lots of different explanations. Some of them are incredibly complicated. Why 24 hours? There is a reason for it, but nobody's absolutely sure what it is. But one theory is that, again, look at your body. Yeah. If you look at your hand, you will see that uh, the fingers, you've got 3 segments on each finger, so that makes 12. And then you've got the thumb, so you could use the thumb to kind of touch particular hours, which is not an unknown technique within, or it's just a practical way of. So instead of going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually, there's a slightly more complicated way of counting on your fingers. That's a possibility. That's a strong possibility if that's why there are 12. Of course, 12 hours of the night, you use the stars to measure the passage. In the day, you can't see the stars, so you have basically you use the sun and the shadows of the sun, and you have a thing called a shadow clock. It's the main method of measuring the passage of the 12 hours of the day. I think that's really fascinating as well. As I say, there is a much more complicated explanation of that, but the human body and its functions in all aspects, including sex and reproduction, actually does dominate Egyptian magical religious thought. So the fact that things like the measurements of the body, the techniques of the body, as I say, would be so significant in the way they sort of parcel up the universe is makes complete sense to us, and it's kind of like pagan, I think. Okay, so I've spoken for a little while, probably too much, but there's a good subject, and it's probably better to do it a little bit of a time. So I've introduced the idea of Decans again, which is these 36 constellations that rise and fall throughout the night, but also on a cycle throughout the year. So next time, we'll have another look at a different form of star clock and decanal clock, and we'll see how the Egyptians used that as a sort of an alarm clock in a way to set off a particular type of spell. So that's very, very fascinating in its own right. So more astronomy, more beautiful images from Egypt. So, but I think that's something to absorb for now. And hope you enjoyed that. See you next time. Seneb T.